My name is Juliana Martinez, I'm 29 years old, and I just discovered that my mother's obsession with keeping our house clutter-free cost me the opportunity of a lifetime. While she was throwing away what she called my stupid little business cards, last Tuesday morning, the CEO of Henderson Global Industries was at that very moment instructing her assistant to track me down using the contact information on that exact card. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony would have been hilarious if it weren't so devastating. For 3 years, Victoria Henderson had been trying to reach me through various channels, but the one direct line she finally obtained ended up in our kitchen trash can, soaked in coffee grounds and yesterday's leftover spaghetti sauce. My mother, Patricia Martinez, had been cleaning out what she termed my entrepreneurial mess from the dining room table when she made the decision that would haunt both of us for months to come. I had been networking at industry events for the past 4 years, building connections and establishing my consulting practice in sustainable packaging solutions. Every conference, every meet and greet, every awkward elevator conversation was an investment in my future. Those business cards weren't just pieces of paper with my contact information, they were lifelines to potential clients, collaborators, and mentors who could transform my one-woman operation into something substantial. But to my mother, they represented everything she despised about my chosen path. The uncertainty, the lack of structure, the absence of a steady paycheck and health insurance benefits. She had watched me graduate summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in environmental engineering, only to turn down multiple corporate job offers to start what she called another one of your projects. The disappointment in her voice every time she introduced me to her bridge club friends as still figuring things out had become a familiar sting. Patricia Martinez had immigrated from El Salvador in 1978 with nothing but determination and a fierce belief in the American dream. She worked 3 jobs while learning English, saved every penny, and eventually opened a small but successful alterations shop in our Chicago neighborhood. Her version of success was tangible, predictable, and safe. A storefront with her name on it, regular customers who paid in cash, and the respect of a community that watched her build something from scratch through pure grit and discipline. My approach to business baffled her completely. I worked from coffee shops with my laptop, attended networking events where people exchanged information instead of money, and talked about building relationships rather than immediate transactions. When I tried to explain that modern business development required a different strategy, she would shake her head and mutter something in Spanish about young people and their fantasies. The morning of the Great Business Card Purge started like any other Tuesday. I had returned from a 3-day sustainable packaging summit in Denver the night before, exhausted but energized by the connections I had made. The event had been extraordinary. Representatives from major corporations were actively seeking innovative solutions for their environmental packaging challenges, and my presentations on biodegradable alternatives had generated significant interest. I had collected dozens of business cards from potential clients and collaborators, each one representing hours of meaningful conversation about partnership opportunities. More importantly, I had distributed nearly 200 of my own cards to decision-makers who expressed genuine interest in my services. The follow-up emails alone would keep me busy for weeks, but the potential for major contracts made every caffeine-fueled conversation worthwhile. My ritual after returning from conferences was always the same. I would spread all the collected business cards across our dining room table, categorize them by priority and potential, and create a systematic follow-up plan. Some contacts warranted immediate phone calls, others required carefully crafted emails with specific project proposals, and a few needed additional research before any outreach. It was methodical work that required space and organization. Our dining room table, a sturdy oak piece my mother had purchased secondhand 15 years ago, served as my temporary command center. I arranged the cards in neat rows, color-coded, with sticky notes indicating my follow-up timeline. Red for immediate contact, yellow for within the week, green for longer-term relationship building. It looked chaotic to anyone unfamiliar with my system, but every card had its place and purpose. I had been up until nearly 2 a.m. creating detailed notes about each connection in my CRM system, cross-referencing conversation details with LinkedIn profiles and company information. The Denver Summit had been unlike any previous conference. The urgency around sustainable packaging solutions had created an almost frantic energy among attendees. Companies were facing increasing pressure from consumers and regulators to address their environmental impact, and many were scrambling for viable alternatives to traditional packaging materials. 3 conversations from the summit stood out as potentially transformative. A packaging director from a major beverage company had spent 45 minutes discussing their need for a consultant who could help redesign their entire product line packaging. The sustainability officer from a prominent cosmetics brand had practically begged for my contact information, explaining that their current packaging supplier had failed to meet environmental standards and they needed alternatives within 6 months. Most intriguingly, a representative from what she described as a Fortune 500 company that prefers to remain unnamed during initial discussions had exchanged cards with me and mentioned that her CEO was actively seeking consultants with my specific expertise. The unnamed company representative, a professional woman in her 50s who introduced herself simply as Margaret, had been vague about details but emphatic about the urgency. Her company was facing a major packaging crisis that required immediate attention from someone with both technical expertise and innovative thinking. She had taken one of my cards and promised that someone would contact me within the week. The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from biodegradable polymers to consumer acceptance. Testing of alternative materials. Margaret's interest had been particularly flattering because she clearly understood the technical aspects of sustainable packaging in a way that many potential clients did not. She asked sophisticated questions about material durability, cost scalability, and integration with existing manufacturing processes. Her knowledge suggested she represented a company with significant resources and genuine commitment to environmental responsibility rather than mere PR posturing. When I finally went to bed Monday night, I felt optimistic about the future for the first time in months. The financial strain of building a consulting practice had been wearing on me, and the constant skepticism from my family had begun to erode my confidence. But the Denver summit had validated my expertise and confirmed that the market for sustainable packaging solutions was expanding rapidly. I overslept Tuesday morning, which was unusual for me but understandable given my late night. When I stumbled into the kitchen around 9 a.m., searching for coffee and clarity, I found my mother standing at the sink with a satisfied expression and rubber gloves covered in garbage disposal residue. The dining room table behind her was completely bare, polished to its usual shine. "Good morning, Mija," she said cheerfully, as if she hadn't just destroyed 3 days of networking efforts. "I cleaned up your mess from the table. All those little papers were making the room look like a hurricane hit it." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I rushed to the dining room, hoping she had simply moved the cards to another location. But the table was pristine. Empty. Not a single business card remained. "Mom, where are the business cards that were on this table?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. "In the garbage where they belong," she replied matter-of-factly, continuing to scrub the sink. "Juliana, you're almost 30 years old. You can't keep treating my dining room like your office. Those little cards were scattered everywhere, and I'm hosting my book club tomorrow. What would the ladies think if they saw that disaster?" I ran to the kitchen trash can, but it was too late. The garbage had already been emptied into the larger outdoor bin, which had been collected by the sanitation crew an hour earlier. Everything was gone. 3 days of networking, dozens of potential client connections, hundreds of my own cards distributed to decision-makers who now had no way to reach me, all reduced to landfill waste. Those weren't just papers, Mom. Those were business contacts. People who want to hire me for major projects. Some of them represent million-dollar contracts. She turned off the water and faced me with that expression I knew too well. The one that said she was about to deliver another lecture about responsibility and realistic expectations. "Juliana, I love you, but you need to stop living in this fantasy world. Real business doesn't happen with little cards and coffee shop meetings. It happens in offices with contracts and signatures and regular paychecks. When are you going to accept a real job and start building a real future?" The conversation that followed was a replay of hundreds we had shared over the past 4 years. Her concerns about my financial stability, my attempts to explain the changing nature of modern business, her comparisons to my cousin Roberto who had become an accountant with a steady income and a 401k plan. It was exhausting and futile, but this time felt different because the stakes were so much higher. I tried to explain that one of those discarded cards might have connected me to the breakthrough client I had been seeking, but she dismissed the possibility with a wave of her hand. In her worldview, important business opportunities came through formal channels, not casual conversations at conferences. The idea that a major corporation would seek out consultants through networking events seemed as fantastical to her as winning the lottery. What she couldn't understand was that my industry operated differently than her alterations business. Sustainable packaging consulting required building trust and relationships before any formal agreements could be discussed. Companies needed to know that their consultant understood both the technical challenges and the market pressures they faced. Those conversations at conferences weren't casual small talk, they were extended job interviews disguised as professional networking. The loss felt overwhelming not just because of the immediate missed opportunities, but because it represented everything that was wrong with my relationship with my family. They couldn't see the value in what I was building because it didn't match their definition of legitimate work. My success metrics were invisible to them, which made my struggles seem like failures and my progress appear non-existent. As I stood in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, staring at the empty space where my future connections had been just hours before, I realized that something fundamental needed to change. I couldn't continue building a business while living in an environment where my efforts were literally thrown away. But I also couldn't abandon my mother, who had sacrificed so much to give me opportunities she never had. The phone rang as I was contemplating my next move, still reeling from the discovery of the discarded cards. My mother answered with her usual cheerful phone voice, the one she reserved for potential customers and important calls. Martinez residence, Patricia speaking. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end, and then her expression began to change. The cheerful customer service smile faded, replaced by confusion and then something that looked suspiciously like concern. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? You're looking for who?" Another pause. I watched as her face went through several more transformations, settling finally on an expression I had never seen before. It was the look of someone realizing they had made a terrible mistake. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Margaret Chen, executive assistant to Victoria Henderson, CEO of Henderson Global Industries. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from years of managing high-stakes communications for corporate leadership. She explained that she had been instructed to locate me urgently regarding a consulting opportunity that could not wait for standard procurement processes. My mother handed me the phone with trembling fingers, her earlier confidence about disposing of worthless papers evaporating as she realized the magnitude of her error. Margaret Chen continued explaining that Ms. Henderson had received my business card through a mutual connection and had been trying to reach me through multiple channels for the past week. The Denver conference had been their latest attempt to establish contact, and my card was their only direct line to me. Henderson Global Industries, Margaret explained, was facing an environmental packaging crisis that threatened their relationship with major retail partners. 3 of their largest clients had issued ultimatums regarding sustainable packaging alternatives, with deadlines that were rapidly approaching. They needed a consultant who could assess their current packaging portfolio, recommend viable alternatives, and implement solutions within an impossibly tight timeline. The company had already spent months interviewing established consulting firms, but most were either too expensive, too slow, or too rigid in their approaches. Victoria Henderson had heard about my work through industry connections and was specifically seeking someone who could provide innovative solutions without the bureaucratic delays of larger firms. The urgency in Margaret's voice made it clear that this was far from a routine consulting inquiry. As Margaret described the scope of the potential project, I felt a mixture of excitement and dread. This was exactly the type of breakthrough opportunity I had been working toward for 4 years, but the timing couldn't have been worse. My primary contact information had just been destroyed, and I had no way to reach the dozens of other potential clients who might be trying to contact me based on our Denver conversations. Henderson Global Industries was a Fortune 500 company with annual revenues exceeding $12 billion. They manufactured and distributed consumer goods across 14 countries, with packaging requirements that spanned everything from food products to electronics to personal care items. The environmental packaging consultant position would involve analyzing thousands of product lines and recommending sustainable alternatives that met both environmental standards and cost requirements. Margaret scheduled a preliminary phone interview for the following morning, explaining that Victoria Henderson preferred to conduct initial assessments personally rather than delegating to human resources. The CEO's direct involvement in the hiring process was unusual but reflected the critical nature of the packaging crisis they were facing. After ending the call, I turned to face my mother, who had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing alarm. The reality of what she had thrown away was beginning to sink in, and her usual defensive justifications seemed inadequate against the evidence of a Fortune 500 CEO actively seeking my services. "How was I supposed to know?" she asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "They looked like all the other little cards you collect at those meetings." I tried to explain that this was exactly why those conferences were so important. Why networking required patience and systematic follow-up, why her dismissal of my business development efforts had been so frustrating. But even as I spoke, I realized that my mother's perspective was shaped by decades of experience in a completely different business environment, Patricia Martinez had built her success through direct customer relationships in a local market. Her clients came to her shop, examined her work, and paid for completed services. The idea that major business opportunities could emerge from casual conversations with strangers at conferences was genuinely foreign to her worldview. In her experience, important customers presented themselves obviously and immediately, not through complex networking processes that required months of cultivation. The cultural dimension of our conflict was also becoming clearer. My mother's immigrant experience had taught her to value visible, tangible success over potential opportunities. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to trust in possibilities that couldn't be guaranteed. Her skepticism about my consulting practice wasn't just about business models, it was about survival strategies learned through years of economic uncertainty, but understanding her perspective didn't diminish the immediate crisis I was facing. Margaret Chen's phone call had confirmed my worst fears about the discarded business cards. Other potential clients were likely trying to reach me, but without my contact information, they would eventually move on to other consultants. The window for capitalizing on the Denver conference connections was rapidly closing. I spent the rest of Tuesday trying to reconstruct my networking efforts through memory and social media research. LinkedIn provided some assistance in identifying conference attendees I had met, but many of the most promising connections had been with representatives who maintained low public profiles for competitive reasons. The beverage company packaging director and the cosmetics brand sustainability officer were particularly difficult to track down without their business cards. The systematic follow-up plan I had developed was useless without the contact information. It was designed to organize. I had detailed notes about conversation topics and follow-up commitments, but no way to reach the people who were expecting to hear from me. The professional relationships I had worked so hard to establish were dissolving. Due to my apparent failure to maintain contact. My mother attempted to help by suggesting I call the Denver conference organizers to request attendee contact information, but conference privacy policies prohibited sharing participant details. She also recommended contacting the hotel where the event was held, as if they would maintain records of individual networking conversations. Her suggestions reflected a genuine desire to fix the situation, but also revealed how little she understood about professional networking protocols. The evening brought a series of difficult conversations with my closest friends and mentors about the business card disaster. Sarah Kim, a fellow Northwestern graduate who had successfully transitioned from corporate employment to independent consulting, listened to my account with sympathetic horror. She understood exactly what I had lost because she had experienced similar networking breakthroughs in her own career transition. You can't recreate those organic conversations, Sarah explained during our phone call. The people you met at Denver were in a specific mindset, dealing with immediate business pressures that made them receptive to new solutions. If you wait too long to follow up, their priorities will shift, and the opportunities will disappear. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my former environmental engineering professor who had encouraged me to pursue consulting, offered a different perspective. She suggested that the Henderson Global Industries opportunity alone might justify the loss of other connections, particularly if the project led to additional referrals within their industry network. Major corporations often shared consultant recommendations with peer companies, especially when dealing with similar environmental challenges, but Dr. Walsh also emphasized the importance of learning from the experience to prevent future disasters. She recommended establishing a separate office space where my business materials would be safe from well-meaning family interference. The suggestion was practical but highlighted the fundamental issue: my living situation was incompatible with serious business development efforts. Wednesday morning arrived with the promise of redemption through the Henderson Global Industries interview, but also with fresh anxiety about my ability to handle such a significant opportunity. Victoria Henderson's reputation in the business community was formidable. She had transformed Henderson Global from a regional manufacturer into an international corporation through aggressive expansion and innovative partnerships. Her direct involvement in consultant selection suggested both the critical nature of their packaging crisis and her hands-on management style. Margaret Chen called precisely at 9 a.m. to conduct pre-interview logistics, confirming technical requirements for the video conference and outlining the interview format. Victoria Henderson would spend the first 30 minutes discussing the scope of Henderson Global's packaging challenges, followed by detailed questions about my experience and approach to similar projects. The final portion would focus on timeline, expectations and project logistics. The technical requirements alone indicated the sophistication of Henderson Global's operations. They used enterprise-level video conferencing software with security protocols that required advanced setup and testing. Margaret emailed detailed instructions for accessing their corporate network, along with a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that needed to be executed before the interview could proceed. Reading through the non-disclosure agreement revealed the magnitude of Henderson Global's packaging crisis. They were facing potential loss of major retail partnerships worth hundreds of millions in annual revenue if they couldn't implement sustainable packaging solutions within specific deadlines. The urgency was driven by consumer pressure, regulatory requirements, and competitive factors that had converged into a perfect storm of environmental responsibility demands. My mother observed my interview preparations with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. She watched me transform our living room into a professional video conference setup, testing camera angles and lighting to ensure optimal presentation quality. The contrast between her initial dismissal of my business cards and her current recognition of a Fortune 500 interview opportunity created a tension that neither of us knew how to address directly. "I'm sorry about the cards, Mija," she said quietly while I adjusted my laptop position. "I didn't understand." Her apology was genuine but incomplete. She was sorry about this specific mistake because its consequences had become obvious, but she still didn't understand the broader principle of supporting my business development efforts. The Henderson Global opportunity was validating my approach, but it was also an isolated example that might not change her fundamental skepticism about my career path. The interview itself exceeded every expectation I had developed during my consulting career. Victoria Henderson was simultaneously intimidating and engaging, asking detailed technical questions that demonstrated her personal involvement in understanding Henderson Global's packaging challenges. She had clearly researched my background thoroughly, referencing specific projects from my portfolio and asking follow-up questions that revealed genuine interest in my problem-solving approach. More significantly, Victoria Henderson understood the innovative aspects of sustainable packaging in ways that most corporate executives did not. She asked sophisticated questions about material properties, manufacturing integration challenges, and consumer acceptance testing. Her knowledge suggested that Henderson Global's commitment to environmental responsibility was driven by genuine understanding rather than superficial compliance requirements. The project scope she described was both exciting and daunting. Henderson Global needed a comprehensive packaging audit across their entire product portfolio, with recommendations for sustainable alternatives that met cost, durability, and aesthetic requirements. The timeline was aggressive: initial assessment within 3 weeks, preliminary recommendations within 6 weeks, and implementation planning within 3 months. But the most remarkable aspect of the interview was Victoria Henderson's direct acknowledgement of the business card situation. Margaret had apparently explained how they had struggled to locate me, and Victoria expressed genuine appreciation for my mother's accidental role in nearly deriving them of my services. "Sometimes the most valuable consultants are the hardest to find," she said with a smile that suggested she understood the irony of the situation. "Your mother may have done us an inadvertent favor by making you so difficult to reach. It confirms that you're focused on your work rather than aggressive self-promotion." By the end of the interview, I felt confident that Henderson Global Industries represented the breakthrough opportunity one had been working toward for 4 years. Victoria Henderson's questions had been challenging but fair, and her obvious expertise in sustainable packaging suggested that working with her would be both profitable and professionally rewarding. The Henderson Global Industries contract arrived via encrypted email exactly 48 hours after my interview with Victoria Henderson. The terms were beyond anything I had imagined possible when I first started my consulting practice. A 6-month engagement with a base fee of $180,000, plus performance bonuses tied to successful implementation of sustainable packaging solutions. Additional clauses provided for contract extensions if the initial phase proved successful, with potential total compensation exceeding $500,000, but the contract also came with requirements that would fundamentally change how I operated my business. Henderson Global expected dedicated availability during their peak project phases, which meant I couldn't take on other major clients simultaneously. They required comprehensive insurance coverage, formal business registration as an LLC, and professional references from previous corporate engagements. Most challenging of all, they expected me to establish a dedicated office space for handling their confidential materials and hosting client meetings. The office requirement created an immediate crisis in my relationship with my mother. Our house had served as my business headquarters for 4 years, with the dining room table functioning as my primary workspace and client meeting area. Patricia had tolerated this arrangement reluctantly, constantly expressing concerns about professional appearances and the disruption to normal family life. The Henderson Global contract made it clear that this makeshift arrangement was no longer sustainable. Finding appropriate office space in Chicago within Henderson Global's timeline proved more complex than I had anticipated. The neighborhoods I could afford were either too far from downtown to be convenient for client meetings or too rundown to project the professional image that a Fortune 500 contract demanded. Premium office buildings required long-term leases with personal guarantees that exceeded my current financial capacity. Even with the Henderson contract secured, commercial real estate agents showed me dozens of properties that were either too expensive, too small, or too isolated from the business districts where my potential clients operated. The few spaces that met my requirements had waiting lists or required substantial upfront investments in furniture and technology infrastructure. I was caught in the classic entrepreneurial bind of needing to spend money I didn't yet have to. Secure Income One had already committed to earning. My mother's response to the office search was characteristically practical but emotionally complicated. She offered to help with the security deposit and first month's rent, viewing it as an investment in finally getting my business operations out of her dining room. But she also used the office discussion as an opportunity to revisit her long-standing concerns about my career choice and the financial instability of independent consulting. This Henderson company might disappear tomorrow, she warned while we reviewed potential office listings. What happens to your expensive lease if they decide to cancel the contract? At least with a real job, you know there's a steady paycheck coming every 2 weeks. Her concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Corporate consulting contracts could be terminated with relatively short notice if priorities changed or budgets were revised. The office lease would represent a fixed monthly expense that I would be responsible for regardless of my project income. But her focus on the risks rather than the opportunities reflected her fundamental skepticism about my business model. The breakthrough came through an unexpected connection with Maria Santos, a commercial interior designer I had met at a small business networking event 6 months earlier. Maria had been working with a startup company that had recently been acquired, leaving their furnished office space available for sublease. The timing was perfect, and the terms were manageable, a month-to-month arrangement that provided flexibility, without the long-term commitment that had made other spaces prohibitively risky. The office itself exceeded my expectations in every way that mattered. Located in a converted warehouse building in the River North neighborhood, it featured exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an open layout that could accommodate both individual work and client meetings. The previous tenant had installed high-end furniture and technology infrastructure that would have cost me tens of thousands of dollars to purchase independently. More importantly, the building housed a community of creative professionals and consultants who understood the challenges of independent business development. The informal networking opportunities within the building proved immediately valuable, providing connections to graphic designers, marketing specialists, and business attorneys who could support my growing consulting practice. Moving my business operations from my mother's dining room to a dedicated office space created an unexpected emotional shift in our relationship. Patricia visited the new office during my first week there, bringing homemade lunch and expressing genuine pride in what I had accomplished. Seeing my business in a professional setting seemed to validate my career choice in ways that years of explanation had failed to achieve. "It looks like a real business now," she admitted while examining my new conference table and professional presentation equipment. "I can see why that Henderson lady wanted to work with you." But the transition also revealed how much my family had been insulating me from the full challenges of independent consulting. Working from home had provided emotional support and practical conveniences that I hadn't fully appreciated until they were gone. The isolation of spending entire days alone in the office was more difficult than I had anticipated, particularly during the intensive research phases of the Henderson Global project. The Henderson Global packaging audit began with a comprehensive analysis of their current product portfolio, which included over 3,000 individual items across multiple product categories. Each item required detailed evaluation of its packaging materials, manufacturing processes, cost structures, and environmental impact. The scope was overwhelming, but Victoria Henderson had provided access to internal resources and data that made the analysis feasible. Working with Henderson Global's internal teams revealed the sophistication of their operations and the complexity of their packaging challenges. Their products were manufactured in facilities across 12 countries, distributed through partnerships with hundreds of retailers, and subject to regulatory requirements that varied significantly between international markets. Any packaging changes needed to accommodate this entire ecosystem while maintaining cost efficiency and product integrity. The environmental pressures driving their packaging crisis were more intense than I had realized during my initial interview. 3 major retail partners had implemented strict sustainable packaging requirements with non-negotiable deadlines. Failure to meet these requirements would result in product removal from thousands of retail locations, with revenue impacts that could affect Henderson Global's quarterly earnings and stock price. But the most significant discovery during my audit was the extent to which Henderson Global had already invested in sustainable packaging research without achieving viable solutions. They had spent over $2 million working with established consulting firms that had produced detailed reports but no practical implementation strategies. The recommendations were either too expensive to implement profitably or too complex to integrate with existing manufacturing processes. Victoria Henderson's decision to hire an independent consultant reflected her frustration with the traditional consulting industry's approach to environmental challenges. Large firms often provided theoretical solutions that looked impressive in presentations but failed when subjected to real-world manufacturing and cost constraints. She was specifically seeking innovative thinking that could bridge the gap between environmental idealism and commercial reality. My approach differed fundamentally from the previous consultants Henderson Global had engaged. Instead of starting with ideal environmental solutions and trying to adapt them to business requirements, I began with their existing manufacturing capabilities and worked forward to identify sustainable alternatives that could be implemented within their operational constraints. This reverse engineering approach proved immediately productive. The breakthrough came during my third week of analysis, when I identified a potential solution for their largest product category that previous consultants had deemed impossible to modify sustainably. By focusing on incremental changes rather than complete redesign, I found ways to reduce environmental impact by 60% while actually decreasing packaging costs by 12%. The solution required coordinating changes across multiple suppliers and manufacturing facilities, but the financial incentives aligned perfectly with environmental goals. Victoria Henderson's response to my preliminary findings exceeded my most optimistic expectations. She scheduled an emergency board presentation to review my recommendations, inviting me to present directly to Henderson Global's executive leadership team. The presentation would determine whether my contract would be extended and potentially expanded to cover additional product lines and international markets. Preparing for the board presentation required skills and confidence that I had never needed in my previous consulting work. Henderson Global's board included former CEOs of major corporations, environmental policy experts, and investors with decades of experience in sustainable business practices. My recommendations would be scrutinized by people who understood both the technical and financial implications of packaging decisions at a global scale. The presentation itself took place in Henderson Global's executive conference room, a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, while sophisticated audiovisual equipment allowed for seamless integration of data presentations and video conferences with international participants. The board members were exactly as formidable as I had expected, asking detailed questions that tested both my technical expertise and my understanding of their business challenges. But the most surprising aspect of the board presentation was the enthusiastic reception my recommendations received. Board members who had been skeptical of previous consulting efforts expressed genuine excitement about the practical applicability of my solutions. The combination of environmental benefits and cost savings addressed their dual priorities in ways that traditional approaches had failed to achieve. The immediate outcome of the board presentation was a contract extension worth an additional $280,000, with provisions for international expansion if the initial implementation proved successful. More significantly, Victoria Henderson offered to serve as a reference for future consulting opportunities, potentially opening doors to other Fortune 500 companies facing similar environmental challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Dr. Amanda Foster, Henderson Global's Chief Sustainability Officer, who had initially been skeptical of hiring an independent consultant for such a critical project. After my presentation, she approached me privately to acknowledge that my innovative approach had solved problems that had stymied their internal teams for months. "You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than our previous consultants achieved. In 6 months," she said. "Your willingness to work within our constraints rather than against them made all the difference." The success with Henderson Global validated everything I had believed about the potential for independent consulting to compete with established firms. My approach was more flexible, more cost-effective, and more innovative than traditional consulting models. But more importantly, it demonstrated that my mother's skepticism about my business had been fundamentally misguided. The irony of her accidentally throwing away the business cards that led to this breakthrough wasn't lost on either of us. During my celebration dinner after the board presentation, Patricia raised her glass with a mixture of pride and sheepishness. "Maybe I should throw away more of your papers," she joked, but the underlying message was clear. She finally understood that my unconventional approach to business development had merit, even when it didn't match her expectations of how professional relationships should be established and maintained. The weeks following my Henderson Global Board presentation brought a cascade of opportunities that fundamentally transformed my consulting practice. Word of my innovative packaging solutions spread through industry networks faster than I had ever imagined possible. Victoria Henderson had apparently shared details of our successful collaboration with her peers at other major corporations, triggering a series of inquiries that quickly overwhelmed my capacity to respond effectively. The first unexpected contact came from Rachel Morrison, Chief Operating Officer at Pinnacle Consumer Brands, a Fortune 200 company that manufactured household cleaning products. Rachel had heard about my work through her friendship with Victoria Henderson and was facing similar sustainable packaging pressures from environmental advocacy groups and regulatory agencies. Her company needed solutions for over 1,500 product lines within an 8-month timeline, with potential contract value exceeding $400,000. But Rachel's inquiry revealed a troubling pattern that would soon become a recurring theme. She had been trying to reach me through multiple channels for over 2 weeks, including attempts to contact me through the business card I had distributed at the Denver conference. The packaging crisis at Pinnacle Consumer Brands was accelerating rapidly, and they were considering other consulting options if they couldn't establish communication with me soon. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My mother's disposal of those Denver conference business cards hadn't just cost me the Henderson Global opportunity that we had fortunately recovered. It had potentially eliminated dozens of other connections with decision-makers who were now pursuing alternative solutions. The ripple effects of that Tuesday morning cleaning spree were expanding far beyond what either of us had initially understood. I immediately called Margaret Chen at Henderson Global to explain the situation and ask if she could help me reconstruct any other contacts from the Denver conference. Margaret's response was both helpful and alarming. Victoria Henderson had obtained my business card through a chain of 3 different industry connections, each of whom had struggled to locate current contact information for me. The difficulty in reaching me had actually enhanced my reputation for exclusivity, but it had also caused several potential clients to pursue other consultants rather than continue searching. Margaret provided contact information for 2 other executives who had specifically asked Victoria Henderson about my availability for similar projects. Both represented major corporations with urgent sustainable packaging needs, and both had been frustrated by their inability to establish direct contact with me. The missed opportunities were staggering, representing potential revenue that could have transformed my consulting practice from a promising startup into a thriving enterprise. The scope of what I had lost became clearer as I systematically contacted every person I could remember meeting at the Denver conference. LinkedIn searches and industry directory research helped me identify many of the attendees, but the personal connection established through our face-to-face conversations had been severed by the lack of follow-up contact. Several potential clients had moved forward with other consultants after waiting what they considered a reasonable time for me to respond to their initial interest. David Kim, the packaging director from the major beverage company I had spoken with extensively at Denver, was particularly direct about his disappointment. His company had delayed their consultant selection process for 3 weeks specifically to give me time to follow up on our conversation. When I failed to contact him, they assumed I wasn't interested in their project and signed a contract with a competing firm. The lost opportunity represented a $250,000 engagement that would have provided exactly the type of high-profile reference I needed to attract additional Fortune 500 clients. The cosmetics brand sustainability officer, Jennifer Walsh, had experienced similar frustration with my apparent lack of professional follow-through. Her company was facing immediate regulatory pressure that required rapid implementation of sustainable packaging alternatives. My failure to contact her within their decision-making timeline had forced them to select a consultant who was less technically qualified but more responsive to their communication attempts. The missed opportunity was valued at over $180,000, with potential for additional international contracts if the initial project proved successful. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came from Dr. Sarah Chen, a packaging research director at a pharmaceutical company that had been seeking consultants for a highly specialized project involving biodegradable medical device packaging. Her project represented not just significant revenue potential, but also the opportunity to work on cutting-edge applications that could establish me as a leading expert in medical packaging sustainability. Dr. Chen had been specifically referred to me by a mutual contact who had attended my Denver presentation. But her attempts to reach me through the business card I had provided had failed completely. The pharmaceutical packaging project was particularly significant because it involved regulatory compliance challenges that few consultants had the technical expertise to address. Medical device packaging requires sterility maintenance, durability under extreme conditions, and compatibility with complex supply chain requirements. Success in this specialized field could have opened doors to additional projects with other pharmaceutical and medical device companies, creating a lucrative niche within the broader sustainable packaging market. As I documented the full extent of the missed opportunities, the financial impact became staggering. The projects I could identify and verify represented over $1.2 million in lost revenue, but the secondary effects of those missed connections were potentially even more valuable. Each successful project would have generated references and recommendations that could have led to additional opportunities within expanding networks of corporate clients. The emotional toll of these discoveries was compounded by my mother's reaction to learning about the broader implications of her cleaning decisions. Patricia had initially been defensive about the business card incident, viewing it as an honest mistake that had been resolved successfully through the Henderson Global contract. But as the scope of the missed opportunities became clear, her defensive stance gave way to genuine remorse and a deeper understanding of how her actions had affected my professional development. "I had no idea that those little cards were so important," she said during one of our difficult conversations about the situation. "I thought if people were really serious about working with you, they would find another way to contact you." Her assumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern business development operates. In her experience with the alterations shop, serious customers presented themselves directly and persistently. The idea that major corporate contracts could be lost through communication delays was foreign to her understanding of business relationships. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her recognition of the damage caused by her well-intentioned cleaning efforts created a new dynamic in our relationship. The crisis forced me to completely restructure how I managed business development and client communications. I implemented multiple redundant contact systems to ensure that potential clients could reach me through various channels even if one method failed. I established a professional phone line separate from our family number, created multiple email addresses for different types of inquiries, and developed systematic follow-up procedures that would prevent future communication failures. But the most significant change was my decision to hire Rebecca Torres as a part-time business development coordinator. Rebecca was a recent Northwestern graduate with marketing experience who could handle initial client inquiries, manage my calendar, and ensure that promising leads were never lost due to administrative oversights. Her salary represented a significant expense for my consulting practice, but the Henderson Global contract provided sufficient revenue to justify the investment in professional support. Rebecca's first assignment was to conduct a comprehensive audit of my networking activities and contact management systems. Her analysis revealed systematic weaknesses that went far beyond the business card disposal incident. I had been inconsistent in following up with conference contacts, disorganized in tracking potential client communications, and naive about the importance of maintaining professional visibility between active projects. The audit also identified opportunities to recover some of the missed connections through strategic outreach and relationship building. While the immediate project opportunities had been lost, many of the contacts I had failed to reach were facing ongoing sustainable packaging challenges that would require consultant support in the future. Rebecca developed a systematic approach to re-establishing these relationships without appearing desperate or unprofessional. Her strategy involved leveraging my success with Henderson Global as a credibility foundation for renewed contact with previously missed opportunities. Rather than apologizing for my earlier communication failures, we positioned my exclusive focus on the Henderson Global project as evidence of my commitment to client success and quality deliverables. This approach allowed us to re-engage with several contacts without having to explain the embarrassing details of the business card incident. The results of Rebecca's outreach efforts were encouraging but mixed. Some contacts had moved forward with other consultants and were locked into long-term contracts, making immediate opportunities impossible. Others had delayed their sustainable packaging initiatives due to budget constraints or changing corporate priorities. But several contacts expressed renewed interest in working with me for future projects, particularly given the high-profile success of my Henderson Global engagement. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a sustainability director at a major food packaging company, was particularly receptive to renewed discussions about potential collaboration. His company had postponed their sustainable packaging initiative after their initial consultant selection process failed to identify viable candidates. My proven track record with Henderson Global provided exactly the credibility they needed to move forward with confidence. The potential project represented a $320,000 engagement with possibilities for expansion into their international operations. The experience of rebuilding these professional relationships taught me valuable lessons about the importance of systematic business development processes. The creative and technical aspects of sustainable packaging consulting were only part of what was required for success. Equally important were the administrative and communication systems that ensured potential opportunities were identified, cultivated, and converted into actual projects, but the most profound impact of the crisis was on my relationship with my mother and our family dynamics. Patricia's recognition of how her actions had affected my professional development created space for more honest conversations about our different approaches to business and career development. She began asking more detailed questions about my work, showing genuine interest in understanding the technical challenges and industry dynamics that shaped my consulting practice. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Patricia still expressed concerns about the financial uncertainty of independent consulting and occasionally suggested the security advantages of traditional employment. But her comments now reflected informed understanding of my industry rather than dismissive skepticism. She had seen concrete evidence of my professional capabilities and the market demand for my expertise. More importantly, she had learned to respect the systems and processes that supported my business development efforts. The dining room table incident had taught her that what appeared to be casual networking materials might actually represent significant professional opportunities. She now asked before disposing of any papers or materials related to my work. Recognizing that her perspective on their importance might be incomplete, the crisis had also strengthened my determination to succeed as an independent consultant despite the challenges and setbacks. The missed opportunities from the Denver conference were frustrating, but they also demonstrated the market demand for my services and the potential for continued growth. Rather than viewing the business card incident as a devastating failure, I began to see it as a learning experience that had ultimately made my consulting practice stronger and more professional. The moment of complete revelation arrived on a Thursday afternoon in November, 3 months after the business card incident. That had nearly derailed my career. I was in my office reviewing quarterly financial reports when Rebecca burst through the door with an expression that mixed excitement and disbelief. She had been conducting routine research on potential clients when she discovered something that would change everything my mother and I thought we understood about that fateful Tuesday morning. "Juliana, you need to see this immediately," Rebecca said, her voice trembling with barely contained urgency. She placed her laptop on my desk, displaying an industry publication article dated just 2 days earlier. The headline read, "Henderson Global CEO credits unknown consultant with saving company millions in sustainable packaging revolution." The article was an in-depth profile of Victoria Henderson's leadership during Henderson Global's environmental transformation. But buried in the detailed narrative was information that made my blood run cold. Victoria Henderson revealed that she had been searching for me for over 3 years, not the few weeks I had assumed. The Denver conference hadn't been her first attempt to establish contact, it had been her final, desperate effort after numerous failed attempts through other channels. According to the article, Victoria Henderson had first learned about my work through a case study presentation I had given at Northwestern University's Environmental Engineering Symposium in 2019. A Henderson Global executive had attended the presentation and returned to the company with enthusiastic recommendations about my innovative approach to sustainable packaging challenges. But when they tried to contact me through the university, they discovered I had graduated and left no forwarding information with the alumni office. The search for me had continued through various industry connections and professional networks. Henderson Global had hired a consulting firm specifically to locate independent consultants with my particular expertise, but the search had been complicated by my relatively low public profile and my practice of working primarily through referrals rather than aggressive marketing. They had eventually identified me as a potential candidate, but establishing direct contact had proved surprisingly difficult. Rebecca continued reading from the article, her voice growing more incredulous with each revelation. Henderson Global actually offered a finder's fee to anyone who could provide current contact information for you. Multiple people at the Denver conference were specifically tasked with locating you and obtaining your business card. The company representative you met, Margaret, wasn't just interested in your services. She had explicit instructions to secure your contact information by any means necessary. The implications of this information were staggering. The business card my mother had thrown away hadn't just been one of dozens of casual networking connections. It had been the culmination of a 3-year corporate search effort backed by substantial financial resources. Henderson Global had invested thousands of dollars and countless hours trying to find me, only to have their success literally thrown in the garbage by someone who thought she was cleaning up clutter. But the article contained even more disturbing revelations about the broader impact of the business card incident. Victoria Henderson had shared her successful collaboration with me with other CEOs facing similar environmental packaging challenges. A network of Fortune 500 executives had been trying to contact me based on Henderson Global's recommendations, but many had experienced the same communication difficulties that had plagued the initial search efforts, the article specifically mentioned. That executives from 6 other major corporations had been frustrated in their attempts to engage my consulting services. Some had eventually moved forward with alternative consultants, while others had delayed their sustainable packaging initiatives indefinitely rather than settle for what they perceived as inferior options. The missed opportunities extended far beyond what Rebecca and I had been able to identify through our systematic outreach efforts. Reading the article triggered a cascade of memories about strange phone calls and messages I had received over the past few years. Multiple people had contacted our family home asking for me by name, but my mother had typically handled these calls with suspicion, assuming they were sales solicitations or scam attempts. She had rarely bothered to mention these calls to me, dismissing them as unimportant based on her assumption that legitimate business opportunities would present themselves through more conventional channels. "How many calls did you not tell me about?" I asked my mother during the confrontation that evening. We were sitting in her kitchen, the same location where she had triumphantly announced cleaning up my entrepreneurial mess 3 months earlier. The contrast between her confident satisfaction then and her current obvious distress was painful to witness. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe dozens over the past few years." They all sounded the same: professional. People asking for Juliana Martinez, but they never explained what they wanted clearly. "I thought they were trying to sell you something or get you involved in some kind of scheme." Her protective instincts had been genuine, but they had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern business development operates. Corporate executives and their assistants often made exploratory calls without providing detailed information about potential projects, especially when dealing with competitive consulting situations. My mother's well-intentioned screening of these calls had effectively isolated me from the very opportunities one had been working so hard to create. The emotional impact of these revelations was overwhelming. I felt anger at my mother for not taking the calls seriously, but also frustration with myself for not establishing clearer communication protocols years earlier. The success I had achieved with Henderson Global was gratifying, but it was overshadowed by the realization that similar opportunities had been available much earlier if only I had been more accessible to potential clients. Rebecca spent the following days conducting intensive research to identify other missed opportunities that might be documented in industry publications or corporate communications. Her investigation revealed additional evidence of the systematic communication failures that had plagued my business development efforts. Trade magazine articles mentioned several major corporations that had struggled to locate qualified sustainable packaging consultants, with some specifically referencing failed attempts to contact consultants whose contact information had proved outdated or unreliable. The research also uncovered evidence that my reputation in the sustainable packaging industry was significantly higher than I had realized. Multiple industry experts had recommended me for high-profile projects, but their recommendations had been undermined by the practical difficulties of establishing contact. My low public profile, which I had considered a strategic advantage that allowed me to focus on quality work rather than marketing, had actually become a significant barrier to business development. Dr. Amanda Foster, Henderson Global's Chief Sustainability Officer, provided additional context when I contacted her to discuss the industry article revelations. She explained that Victoria Henderson's search for me had become something of a legend within sustainability circles, representing the challenges that innovative consultants faced in connecting with potential clients despite strong industry demand for their services. "You were like the holy grail of sustainable packaging consulting," Dr. Foster explained during our phone conversation. "Everyone knew about your work and wanted to hire you, but nobody could figure out how to actually reach you. Victoria's persistence in tracking you down was remarkable, and her success made her something of a hero among other executives facing similar consultant search challenges." The revelation that my professional reputation was much stronger than I had understood was both validating and frustrating. The industry recognition I had been working to achieve was apparently already established, but the communication barriers created by my family situation had prevented me from capitalizing on that reputation. The business opportunities one thought I was building toward had actually been available years earlier, but perhaps the most significant discovery came when Rebecca contacted the Denver conference organizers to request information about attendee feedback and follow-up inquiries. The conference staff revealed that my presentation had generated more post-event inquiries than any other speaker, with over 40 attendees requesting my contact information for potential collaboration discussions. The organizers had attempted to forward these inquiries to me through the contact information I had provided during registration, but many of their messages had apparently never reached me due to the communication screening practices my mother had implemented. The scope of missed opportunities was beyond anything I had imagined possible. The Denver conference alone had generated enough potential business to sustain my consulting practice for several years, but the systematic communication failures had prevented me from realizing any of these opportunities. The business cards my mother had thrown away were just the visible symbol of a much larger problem that had been affecting my professional development for years. The emotional confrontation with my mother about these broader communication failures was one of the most difficult conversations we had ever shared. Patricia was devastated to learn that her protective instincts had actually harmed rather than helped my professional development. She had genuinely believed she was shielding me from sales calls and potential scams, but her lack of understanding about professional networking had caused her to reject legitimate business opportunities consistently. "I was trying to protect you," she said through tears during our kitchen table discussion. "I thought if these people were really serious about working with you, they would be more persistent or more clear about what they wanted. I never imagined that important business people would give up so easily." Her assumption reflected the communication patterns she had learned through decades of running her alterations shop, where serious customers typically presented themselves clearly and persistently. The subtle, professional approach that characterized corporate business development was foreign to her experience and had been consistently misinterpreted as illegitimate or unimportant. The crisis forced us to acknowledge that our family communication patterns had been fundamentally incompatible with my professional development needs. The protective screening that had served Patricia well in her business context had created barriers to opportunity in my different industry environment. We needed to develop new protocols that respected her concerns about protecting our family privacy while ensuring that legitimate professional opportunities could reach me effectively. The weeks following our revelatory confrontation marked the beginning of the most challenging period in my relationship with my mother since I had started my consulting practice. Patricia retreated into herself, consumed by guilt about the opportunities she had inadvertently destroyed and overwhelmed by the complexity of business practices she had never understood. Our daily interactions became stilted and careful, both of us navigating around the enormous weight of what had been lost and what might have been, but the crisis also created space for unprecedented honesty between us. For the first time in years, Patricia asked detailed questions about my work without the underlying assumption that I should be doing something different. She wanted to understand not just what I did, but how the sustainable packaging industry operated, why networking was so crucial, and how professional relationships developed differently than the customer interactions she was familiar with through her alterations business. These conversations revealed the depth of the cultural and generational divide that had shaped our miscommunications. Patricia's immigrant experience had taught her to be suspicious of unsolicited contact from strangers, particularly when they couldn't clearly explain their purposes. In her world, legitimate business opportunities came through established relationships or direct referrals from trusted sources. The idea that major corporations would make exploratory contact without detailed explanations seemed inherently suspicious to someone whose success had depended on clearly defined transactions with known customers. Meanwhile, Rebecca was working systematically to rebuild the professional relationships that had been damaged by years of communication barriers. Her strategy involved leveraging my Henderson Global success as evidence of both my technical capabilities and my newfound accessibility for corporate partnerships. Rather than dwelling on past communication failures, she positioned my previous unavailability as selectivity that had allowed me to focus intensively on delivering exceptional results for chosen clients. The approach proved remarkably effective. Several executives who had given up trying to reach me years earlier expressed renewed interest when Rebecca contacted them with updated information about my availability and recent project successes. The Henderson Global case study provided compelling evidence that I could deliver practical solutions to complex environmental packaging challenges within corporate budget and timeline constraints. Dr. Michael Rodriguez at Peninsula Food Packaging was among the first to respond positively to Rebecca's outreach. His company had postponed their sustainable packaging initiative for over 2 years after failing to identify qualified consultants who combined technical expertise with understanding of food industry regulations. My proven track record with Henderson Global addressed both requirements, and the timing aligned perfectly with Peninsula's renewed commitment to environmental responsibility. The Peninsula project represented a significant opportunity for expanding my consulting practice into the food packaging sector, which presented unique challenges related to product safety, shelf life requirements, and consumer acceptance of packaging alternatives. Success with Peninsula could establish credibility for additional projects with other food industry companies, creating a specialized niche within the broader sustainable packaging market. But the most significant breakthrough came when Rebecca received an unexpected call from Thomas Chen, a senior vice president at Meridian International, a Fortune 100 corporation that manufactured consumer electronics. Thomas explained that Meridian had been searching for a sustainable packaging consultant for over 18 months, having been referred to me initially by a mutual connection at Northwestern University. Their attempts to establish contact had been unsuccessful, but they had continued monitoring my professional activities through industry publications and conference attendance. The Henderson Global Case Study had convinced Meridian's executive team that I possessed the innovative thinking and practical implementation skills they needed for their global packaging transformation initiative. The project scope was extraordinary: analysis and redesign of packaging systems for over 5,000 product lines across 47 countries, with potential contract value exceeding $800,000. More importantly, success with Meridian could establish international credibility that would open doors to additional global consulting opportunities. Thomas Chen's call also revealed another disturbing pattern in the missed communication incidents. Meridian had actually hired a recruiting firm 18 months earlier specifically to locate and contact me regarding their packaging consultant needs. The recruiting firm had made multiple attempts to reach me through various channels, including several phone calls to our family home that my mother had dismissed as telemarketing attempts. "We were told that reaching you directly was extremely difficult," Thomas explained during our initial conversation. "Our recruiting firm described you as notoriously selective about client engagements, which actually increased our interest. We assumed your unavailability reflected high demand for your services rather than communication barriers." The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. My mother's protective screening of business calls had created a reputation for exclusivity that actually enhanced my professional desirability. Corporate clients had interpreted my apparent unavailability as evidence of success and selectivity, making them more determined to secure my services. The communication barriers that I had experienced as professional isolation had been perceived by potential clients as strategic positioning. Rebecca's systematic analysis of these communication patterns revealed that my professional reputation in the sustainable packaging industry was significantly more established than I had realized. Multiple industry experts regularly recommended me for high-profile projects, but the practical difficulties of establishing contact had created a mystique around my consulting practice that actually increased demand for my services. The revelation fundamentally changed how I understood my position in the market. Rather than being an unknown consultant struggling to establish credibility, I was apparently a recognized expert whose services were actively sought by major corporations. The challenge hadn't been building professional reputation, it had been making myself accessible to the clients who already wanted to work with me. This understanding transformed my approach to business development and client relations. Instead of focusing on marketing and self-promotion to generate interest, I needed to concentrate on accessibility and systematic communication to capitalize on existing demand. The Henderson Global success had provided proof that I could deliver results when given the opportunity, but the broader challenge was ensuring that similar opportunities could reach me effectively. The emotional impact of these realizations was complex and difficult to process. I felt validated by the evidence of strong industry recognition, but also frustrated by the years of missed opportunities that had resulted from preventable communication failures. The success I was experiencing felt both earned and delayed, representing achievements that could have been realized much earlier under different circumstances. My relationship with my mother continued evolving as she gained deeper understanding of how her protective instincts had affected my professional development. Patricia began actively participating in developing new communication protocols that would ensure legitimate business opportunities could reach me while still protecting our family from unwanted solicitation attempts. She proposed establishing specific procedures for handling calls requesting me by name, including questions designed to distinguish between legitimate business inquiries and sales attempts. Her experience in customer service through the alterations business actually provided valuable insights into professional phone screening that could be adapted to my consulting practice needs. More significantly, Patricia offered to take formal training in business communication practices so she could more effectively support my professional development. The gesture was unprecedented in our relationship and represented her recognition that my success required her active cooperation rather than passive tolerance. The training sessions, conducted by a local business development consultant, proved enlightening for both of us. Patricia learned about the subtle communication patterns that characterized professional business inquiries, while I gained better understanding of why her previous screening decisions had seemed reasonable from her perspective. The consultant helped us develop protocols that balanced family privacy concerns with professional accessibility requirements, but perhaps the most meaningful change was Patricia's decision to become actively involved in supporting my business development efforts rather than simply tolerating them. She began maintaining detailed records of all business-related calls and messages, ensuring that no potential opportunities would be lost due to communication oversights. Her systematic approach to record-keeping developed through years of managing customer information for her alterations business, proved highly effective for tracking professional inquiries and follow-up requirements. The transformation in our relationship extended beyond business communication to encompass broader understanding of each other's perspectives and priorities. Patricia gained appreciation for the strategic thinking and long-term planning required for successful consulting practice development. I developed deeper respect for the protective instincts and practical wisdom that had guided her decisions, even when those decisions had inadvertently created professional obstacles. By December, the systematic efforts to rebuild missed professional relationships were generating tangible results. 3 major corporations had initiated formal consulting discussions, with combined potential contract value exceeding $1.5 million. The Peninsula Food Packaging project had been confirmed, with contract execution scheduled for January. Meridian International had requested a detailed project proposal for their global packaging transformation initiative. Most significantly, Victoria Henderson had agreed to serve as a formal reference for future client engagements, providing credibility that would expedite the consultant selection processes for other corporations. Her willingness to actively support my business development efforts represented recognition that our successful collaboration had been mutually beneficial and worth continuing through additional projects or referrals. The year that had begun with a devastating communication crisis was concluding with unprecedented professional opportunities and a transformed relationship with my mother. The business card incident that had initially seemed like a career-ending disaster had ultimately forced us to address systematic problems that had been limiting my professional development for years. The painful revelations about missed opportunities had created space for building stronger foundations for future success. 1 year after the business card incident that nearly destroyed my career, I found myself standing in the ballroom of the Chicago Hilton, accepting the Environmental Packaging Innovation Award from the Sustainable Business Council. The audience of 500 industry professionals rose in standing ovation as I concluded my acceptance speech about the importance of accessible innovation and the power of second chances in business relationships. Victoria Henderson was seated at the head table, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been thoroughly validated. The Henderson Global Partnership had not only solved their packaging crisis but had also established new industry standards for cost-effective environmental solutions. Our collaboration had generated over $15 million in savings for their company while reducing their environmental impact by 70% across all major product lines. But the most meaningful presence in that ballroom was my mother, Patricia Martinez, wearing her best dress and sitting in the front row with tears of pride streaming down her face. The woman who had once dismissed my business cards as worthless clutter now carried laminated copies of every article written about my consulting successes. She had become my most enthusiastic supporter and, ironically, one of my most effective business development assets. The transformation in our relationship had been gradual but profound. Patricia's guilty determination to make amends for years of missed opportunities had evolved into genuine understanding of and appreciation for my professional achievements. She had enrolled in a small business development course at the local community college, not because she wanted to change careers, but because she wanted to better understand the world I operated in. Her newfound knowledge had proved surprisingly valuable. Patricia's immigrant perspective and practical business experience provided insights that complemented my technical expertise in ways that strengthened my client relationships. She had become skilled at identifying the underlying concerns behind corporate executives' questions, helping me address both their technical requirements and their business anxieties more effectively. The Meridian International project had been the breakthrough that established my reputation as a global consultant. Their packaging transformation initiative had required coordination across 47 countries, integration with hundreds of suppliers, and compliance with dozens of regulatory frameworks. The complexity had intimidated several larger consulting firms, but my systematic approach and willingness to work within existing constraints had delivered results that exceeded all expectations. Success with Meridian had triggered an avalanche of international opportunities. Companies in Europe, Asia, and South America were seeking consultants who could navigate the intersection of environmental responsibility and practical business requirements. My client list now included 12 Fortune 500 corporations and over 30 smaller companies across 6 continents. Rebecca Torres, who had started as a part-time business development coordinator, was now my full-time operations manager overseeing a team of 4 consultants and 2 administrative staff. The consulting practice that had begun as a one-woman operation from my mother's dining room table had evolved into Martinez Sustainable Solutions, a firm with offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and London. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the relationship I had built with emerging consultants who faced similar challenges in establishing their professional credibility. The Martinez Sustainable Solutions Mentorship Program provided guidance and support for independent consultants who were struggling to connect with corporate clients. We had helped over 60 consultants secure their first major contracts, with combined project values exceeding $8 million. The mentorship program had grown out of my recognition that the communication barriers I had experienced were not unique. Many talented consultants struggled to establish professional relationships with corporate decision-makers, not because they lacked expertise, but because they hadn't learned how to navigate the subtle communication patterns that characterized business development in their industries. Sarah Kim, the fellow Northwestern graduate who had provided emotional support during my darkest moments, had become one of our most successful mentorship program participants. Her consulting practice in renewable energy systems had grown from a struggling startup to a thriving enterprise serving major utility companies across the Midwest. The referral relationships we had developed had proved mutually beneficial, with her clients often needing sustainable packaging solutions and mine frequently requiring renewable energy consultations. The industry recognition that culminated in the Environmental Packaging Innovation Award had been building steadily throughout the year. My case study presentations at major conferences consistently drew standing-room-only audiences. Trade publications regularly featured articles about my innovative approaches to complex packaging challenges. University programs invited me to guest lecture about entrepreneurship and sustainable business practices, but the recognition that meant the most came from clients who had implemented my recommendations successfully. Dr. Amanda Foster at Henderson Global had been promoted to Vice President of Global Sustainability, with her success partly attributed to the packaging innovations we had developed together. Thomas Chen at Meridian International had received a Corporate Excellence Award for his leadership of their Environmental Transformation Initiative. These client successes had created a virtuous cycle of referrals and recommendations that made traditional marketing unnecessary. Corporate executives who had worked with me became enthusiastic advocates for my consulting services, providing credibility and access that no advertising campaign could have achieved. The exclusive reputation that had once been created accidentally by communication barriers was now maintained intentionally through selective client acceptance and exceptional service delivery. The financial transformation of my consulting practice was beyond anything I had imagined when I first started working from my mother's dining room table. Annual revenue had grown from less than $50,000 to over $2.3 million within 18 months. The success had enabled investments in advanced technology, professional development, and office infrastructure that strengthened my competitive position more. Importantly, the financial stability had allowed me to take on pro bono projects for nonprofit organizations and community groups that couldn't afford commercial consulting services. These projects provided opportunities to apply sustainable packaging principles to social causes while maintaining connections to the broader environmental movement that had inspired my career choice. The community impact work had also strengthened my relationship with my mother, who could easily understand the value of helping local businesses and organizations solve practical problems. Patricia had volunteered to assist with several pro bono projects, using her customer service experience to help small business owners understand and implement sustainable packaging alternatives. Her involvement in these projects had been transformative for both of us. Patricia had discovered that her practical business wisdom was valuable in contexts far beyond her alterations shop. Small business owners appreciated her straightforward communication style and her ability to explain complex concepts in accessible terms. I had gained appreciation for the complementary skills she brought to client relationships. The speaking engagement at my acceptance speech had focused on the lessons learned from the business card incident and its aftermath. I had shared the story not as a cautionary tale about family interference, but as an example of how apparent disasters could become catalysts for necessary growth and change. The most important business cards, I had concluded my speech, are not the ones we hand out at networking events. They are the relationships we build through consistent excellence and genuine service to our clients' needs. When we focus on delivering value rather than collecting contacts, the right opportunities will find us, even when our business cards end up in the garbage. The audience had laughed and applauded, but the deeper message was serious. The crisis that had nearly ended my consulting career had ultimately forced me to build stronger foundations for sustainable success. The systematic communication improvements, professional support staff, and client relationship protocols that emerged from the crisis had positioned my practice for growth that would have been impossible under the previous haphazard approach. As I returned to my seat after accepting the award, Patricia caught my eye and nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose support had been instrumental in my success. The woman who had once worried about my lack of steady employment now served on the advisory board of Martinez Sustainable Solutions, providing oversight and guidance for our business development strategies. The journey from that devastating Tuesday morning to this moment of industry recognition had taught me that success often emerges from our response to adversity rather than from the absence of challenges. The business cards my mother had thrown away had represented one approach to professional development, but the crisis that followed had forced me to develop more robust and sustainable methods for building client relationships. Looking back, I realized that the most valuable lesson hadn't been about communication protocols or business development strategies. It had been about the importance of understanding and appreciating different perspectives, even when they initially seem incompatible with our goals. My mother's protective instincts and practical wisdom had created obstacles, but they had also provided insights that ultimately strengthened my consulting practice. The Environmental Packaging Innovation Award would join the other recognition displayed in our Chicago office, but the real measure of success was the thriving business relationships, the satisfied clients, and the transformed family dynamics that had emerged from what had initially seemed like an irreversible disaster. Sometimes the most important opportunities in life come disguised as problems, and sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who ultimately help us grow the most. My mother had taught me both lessons, though neither of us had recognized the value of her teaching at the time. 1 year after the business card incident that nearly destroyed my career, I found myself standing in the ballroom of the Chicago Hilton, accepting the Environmental Packaging Innovation Award from the Sustainable Business Council. The audience of 500 industry professionals rose in standing ovation as I concluded my acceptance speech about the importance of accessible innovation and the power of second chances in business relationships. Victoria Henderson was seated at the head table, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been thoroughly validated. The Henderson Global Partnership had not only solved their packaging crisis but had also established new industry standards for cost-effective environmental solutions. Our collaboration had generated over $15 million in savings for their company while reducing their environmental impact by 70% across all major product lines, but the most meaningful presence in that ballroom was my mother, Patricia Martinez, wearing her best dress and sitting in the front row with tears of pride streaming down her face. The woman who had once dismissed my business cards as worthless clutter now carried laminated copies of every article written about my consulting successes. She had become my most enthusiastic supporter and, ironically, one of my most effective business development assets. The transformation in our relationship had been gradual but profound. Patricia's guilty determination to make amends for years of missed opportunities had evolved into genuine understanding of and appreciation for my professional achievements. She had enrolled in a small business development course at the local community college, not because she wanted to change careers, but because she wanted to better understand the world I operated in. Her newfound knowledge had proved surprisingly valuable. Patricia's immigrant perspective and practical business experience provided insights that complemented my technical expertise in ways that strengthened my client relationships. She had become skilled at identifying the underlying concerns behind corporate executives' questions, helping me address both their technical requirements and their business anxieties more effectively. The Meridian International project had been the breakthrough that established my reputation as a global consultant. Their packaging transformation initiative had required coordination across 47 countries, integration with hundreds of suppliers, and compliance with dozens of regulatory frameworks. The complexity had intimidated several larger consulting firms, but my systematic approach and willingness to work within existing constraints had delivered results that exceeded all expectations. Success with Meridian had triggered an avalanche of international opportunities. Companies in Europe, Asia, and South America were seeking consultants who could navigate the intersection of environmental responsibility and practical business requirements. My client list now included 12 Fortune 500 corporations and over 30 smaller companies across 6 continents. Rebecca Torres, who had started as a part-time business development coordinator, was now my full-time operations manager overseeing a team of 4 consultants and 2 administrative staff. The consulting practice that had begun as a one-woman operation from my mother's dining room table had evolved into Martinez Sustainable Solutions, a firm with offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and London. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the relationship I had built with emerging consultants who faced similar challenges in establishing their professional credibility. The Martinez Sustainable Solutions Mentorship Program provided guidance and support for independent consultants who were struggling to connect with corporate clients. We had helped over 60 consultants secure their first major contracts, with combined project values exceeding $8 million. The mentorship program had grown out of my recognition that the communication barriers I had experienced were not unique. Many talented consultants struggled to establish professional relationships with corporate decision-makers, not because they lacked expertise, but because they hadn't learned how to navigate the subtle communication patterns that characterized business development in their industries. Sarah Kim, the fellow Northwestern graduate who had provided emotional support during my darkest moments, had become one of our most successful mentorship program participants. Her consulting practice in renewable energy systems had grown from a struggling startup to a thriving enterprise serving major utility companies across the Midwest. The referral relationships we had developed had proved mutually beneficial, with her clients often needing sustainable packaging solutions and mine frequently requiring renewable energy consultations. The industry recognition that culminated in the Environmental Packaging Innovation Award had been building steadily throughout the year. My case study presentations at major conferences consistently drew standing room-only audiences. Trade publications regularly featured articles about my innovative approaches to complex packaging challenges. University programs invited me to guest lecture about entrepreneurship and sustainable business practices, but the recognition that meant the most came from clients who had implemented my recommendations successfully. Dr. Amanda Foster at Henderson Global had been promoted to Vice President of Global Sustainability, with her success partly attributed to the packaging innovations we had developed together. Thomas Chen at Meridian International had received a Corporate Excellence Award for his leadership of their Environmental Transformation Initiative. These client successes had created a virtuous cycle of referrals and recommendations that made traditional marketing unnecessary. Corporate executives who had worked with me became enthusiastic advocates for my consulting services, providing credibility and access that no advertising campaign could have achieved. The exclusive reputation that had once been created accidentally by communication barriers was now maintained intentionally through selective client acceptance and exceptional service delivery. The financial transformation of my consulting practice was beyond anything I had imagined when I first started working from my mother's dining room table. Annual revenue had grown from less than $50,000 to over $2.3 million within 18 months. The success had enabled investments in advanced technology, professional development, and office infrastructure that strengthened my competitive position more. Importantly, the financial stability had allowed me to take on pro bono projects for nonprofit organizations and community groups that couldn't afford commercial consulting services. These projects provided opportunities to apply sustainable packaging principles to social causes while maintaining connections to the broader environmental movement that had inspired my career choice. The community impact work had also strengthened my relationship with my mother, who could easily understand the value of helping local businesses and organizations solve practical problems. Patricia had volunteered to assist with several pro bono projects, using her customer service experience to help small business owners understand and implement sustainable packaging alternatives. Her involvement in these projects had been transformative for both of us. Patricia had discovered that her practical business wisdom was valuable in contexts far beyond her alterations shop. Small business owners appreciated her straightforward communication style and her ability to explain complex concepts in accessible terms. I had gained appreciation for the complementary skills she brought to client relationships. The speaking engagement at my acceptance speech had focused on the lessons learned from the business card incident and its aftermath. I had shared the story not as a cautionary tale about family interference, but as an example of how apparent disasters could become catalysts for necessary growth and change. The most important business cards, I had concluded my speech, are not the ones we hand out at networking events. They are the relationships we build through consistent excellence and genuine service to our clients' needs. When we focus on delivering value rather than collecting contacts, the right opportunities will find us, even when our business cards end up in the garbage. The audience had laughed and applauded, but the deeper message was serious. The crisis that had nearly ended my consulting career had ultimately forced me to build stronger foundations for sustainable success. The systematic communication improvements, professional support staff, and client relationship protocols that emerged from the crisis had positioned my practice for growth that would have been impossible under the previous haphazard approach. As I returned to my seat after accepting the award, Patricia caught my eye and nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose support had been instrumental in my success. The woman who had once worried about my lack of steady employment now served on the advisory board of Martinez Sustainable Solutions, providing oversight and guidance for our business development strategies. The journey from that devastating Tuesday morning to this moment of industry recognition had taught me that success often emerges from our response to adversity rather than from the absence of challenges. The business cards my mother had thrown away had represented one approach to professional development, but the crisis that followed had forced me to develop more robust and sustainable methods for building client relationships. Looking back, I realized that the most valuable lesson hadn't been about communication protocols or business development strategies. It had been about the importance of understanding and appreciating different perspectives, even when they initially seem incompatible with our goals. My mother's protective instincts and practical wisdom had created obstacles, but they had also provided insights that ultimately strengthened my consulting practice. The Environmental Packaging Innovation Award would join the other recognition displayed in our Chicago office, but the real measure of success was the thriving business relationships, the satisfied clients, and the transformed family dynamics that had emerged from what had initially seemed like an irreversible disaster. Sometimes the most important opportunities in life come disguised as problems, and sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who ultimately help us grow the most. My mother had taught me both lessons, though neither of us had recognized the value of her teaching at the time. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.